And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Morning Exiles podcast. Today in history, well, yeah, we got that for you.
Got that?
That's about
So
it.
glad.
So I have others. I've also got, you should probably, before you talk, you should get one of these. Mm-hmm. Kevin Gallagher, ladies and gentlemen.
I got this.
I like it. Before we get to our real guests, a little segment that's become known as, boy, these people sure don't know how to speak English in our news media. And Kevin, you found one, and it's not local, but it was good enough to be reported.
It was just a headline on a web version of a news story, but it said basically, math lab explodes and burns. Police not happy with math in that state, I'm sure.
All the horror, all those flashcards.
Math lab explodes and burns. All those poor kids needing their STEM education.
And as I remember it, they were doing it as a breaking news story. So it was full screen with the blurred flashing blue and red lights, and the type was, like covered 2/3 of the screen. Is it math lab explodes?
Math lab explodes and burns. What are you gonna do?
All right, now here's one that is local, and we're gonna give Donovan Jackson, who does their Action Jackson at Channel 9. We're gonna give him a B- on this one because it's kind of tricky. So he was out investigating this effluent going into the parking lot in the grass of
Effluent, that's poo water.
You want to do this story? You want to let me do it?
Go ahead.
Anyway, so he's doing this story, and it's at the Serenity Apartments, and it's anything but serene there. But so he's got the headline, and he says, sewerage affects residents of Serenity Apartments.
Okay.
And people start, because they know we're up for this stuff. He used the word should be effect. It should be effect. No, he used it correctly. It should be AFFECT.
Affect is a verb.
Yes.
Effect is a noun.
And he meant it was an affect, and he was right. So good job on that one for Donovan Jackson. However, sewerage is the piping and the pumps and the actual physical infrastructure.
Sewage is what's carried in that.
Yes, the as you put it, the poo water.
Poo water, yeah.
Yeah, is what these people were having trouble with. So on that one, but we're going to give him a B-.
Give him a B-.
We're going to give him a B- because sewerage actually carries the sewage.
Okay.
And for knowing it properly, you also get a free copy of Phil Collins doing Susu Sulio. But anyway, that is our people don't speak English in the news media anymore report for today.
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? You can't eat them.
I've heard that it's one of those industries, one of those professions where it's hard to break through to where you make really good money. And a lot of these guys, they're struggling. And I think sometimes you get what you pay for.
You know what?
Am I being mean?
You know what? Speaking English properly should not depend on your paycheck because you should learn to do that basically in toto before 8th grade.
In toto?
In toto.
I like that. I love that band, man.
They're not in Kansas anymore. That should have been one of the geography.
All right, let's get down to topics.
Stop it.
Donald Trump is in the state today. He's in Lake Charles. I don't know when these Air Force One is supposed to land.
It'll be a perfect landing. It'll be beautiful handshakes.
We have some wonderful pilots.
Wonderful pilots. Perfect
the best
landing.
Pilots.
Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, perfect.
It'll be perfect.
Tomorrow's election day, and I think early voting gave an indication that a lot of people are going to took advantage of early voting. Because there's a whole lot more that people want to do. We've got a Florida Gators game at LSU. It's hunting season. there's probably a lot of things people would rather do than find their way to the polls. But let's talk a little bit about what's happened so far with early voting and what may be ahead for the election.
A frequent flyer here with us is John Couvillon. John is the founder and the director of JMC Analytics. They specialize in demography and polling. And John gets very, very busy this time of year with the election season. John, good morning to you.
Good to be here today.
Get a little closer to that mic.
Yeah.
You don't need that legal pad. Get it out. You don't need that.
Does he need some slack?
He's got plenty. He's got plenty. All right, there we go. So,
There you go.
So, John, it is the day before. I know that folks in your profession are quite busy when it's time to do the polling. So, what are you seeing? What are you finding in terms of the governor's race first?
So there's really two subplots to the governor's race, as I would say. The first is whether there will or will not be a runoff. I believe there will. The second is which Republican will face Governor Edwards. The polls have actually been fairly tight on that question. I am of the belief that it's more likely than not that Eddie Rispone will make the runoff against Governor Edwards than Ralph Abraham will.
Now then, there are two other candidates, and one of them has the last name Landrieu.
Yes.
And I saw something the other day, I think it was probably Wednesday, that said he's polling at 5%. Now, he hasn't run any media as far as I can tell. Is that just based on the name?
It's based on the name, and there's actually a precedent for that. And that's actually an interesting, I guess, other subplot that you brought up. Last year, when, in my opinion, due to the Kavanaugh hearings, you had a pretty high early voting and election day turnout due to that for what, quite frankly, was an unsexy election cycle. You had 9% of the vote in the Secretary of State's race go to a gentleman named Thomas Kennedy. He didn't even have enough money to file a campaign finance report, yet he got 9% of the vote. And I'm convinced that what happened was people truly thought that he was
It's a Kennedy.
the United States Senator from
Really?
Louisiana. Yes. So given that, I would not be terribly surprised if perhaps the live wire picks off a few percent of the vote. Now, my polling is not showing him anywhere near 5%, but I could see him get perhaps 2 or 3. And another thing that can happen as well, and this kind of gives the Edwards people some discomfort, is that a black Democrat named Omar Dantzler, I'm showing that he's slightly ticked up in the polls and is getting 3%. In other words, he's pulling black votes directly from the Edwards column. I could see him getting 3% and theoretically making it even less possible for Governor Edwards to win without a runoff.
Now, there has been a lot of negativity in the last few days aimed at Governor Edwards.
Yes.
And it had nothing to do with the budget or with taxes or any of that. It was all about Johnny Anderson.
Yes.
They are pretty hard hitting ads.
Yes.
And then there was a counter that looks like it was put together very quickly. A number of females talking about how Governor Edwards has helped women in this state, appointed more to his cabinet. Some of them are very well known.
Yes.
And they trust him, and they said he took action immediately. First of all, did the Johnny Anderson stuff hurt the governor at all? And secondly, was it effectively countered by this new ad?
I would say that the Anderson ads were marginally effective, and I'll tell you why. One of the John Couvillon rules about running attack ads is that once you get into the last week, it really needs to be nothing but positive ads. There's nothing. The voting public has become more and more cynical about last-minute attack ads, and my definition of last minute is at the conclusion of early voting. By then, basically, you need to be doing the closing argument, so to speak, to the voters. So those who were paying for the Johnny Anderson ad waited till pretty much the end of early voting to launch the attack. And the fact that, number one, it was done so late, and number two, the fact that Governor Edwards very quickly came up with a counter to it, I don't think it'll be much of an effect. I do think it marginally knocked him down a point or two, but the fact that Governor Edwards had an effective response to it as quickly as he did, I think will mute the damage, or I guess ameliorate the damage.
Let's move to Lieutenant Governor.
Yes.
I gave this ad my award for the best political ad of the season, and I'm sticking with it. Billy Nungesser, who has very little in the way of opposition.
Yes.
But he's still running some ads to reinforce his name.
And of course, he has Peanuts sitting out at I-10 at Segan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Peanut, the giant elephant, which he didn't have to move around much this year because he has very little.
Right.
But let's talk about style. In his commercial, he's walking through his office. He's very upbeat. He's walking at a brisk pace. He's talking about tourism, which is the major function of the Lieutenant Governor's office.
Yes.
And how it's up, by what was it, 51 million visitors last year. And he says, and they left behind $1.9 billion in taxes that you and I didn't have to pay. And I thought that was a great positioning statement.
Oh, absolutely. Especially since tourism is becoming a major part of the Louisiana economy, and if you as lieutenant governor are over tourism, that's the absolute best selling point you can have as to doing your job.
Well, and again, it's more like I'm doing my job, and it's helping the state, and it's helping you with your tax burden. I think he really nailed it on the message, and I kind of wish the gubernatorial candidates had gone down that route a little more.
Ooh, and actually, on that term, I'm going to, I guess, give an Ides of March type warning to the Republicans for the runoff. You said the word upbeat. One of the things my last poll showed is that not only do voters give a positive job approval rating to Governor Edwards in about the 5 to 3 range, they also are more positive than negative about how Louisiana has done over the last 4 years. What that means in plain English is that if you are running a campaign saying all kinds of nonsense, in my opinion, about help is on the way and how awful Louisiana and Governor Edwards are, to me, you're missing the mark. So just a word of advice to those or the persons who make the runoff on November 16th is what hurts Governor Edwards more is things such as car insurance rates, such as his being a Democrat, but not if he's done a good job, because all Governor Edwards has to do is counter with how he's quote-unquote turned the state around over the last 4 years. So like I said, word of advice to those as they start the runoff campaign come Monday.
Well, I don't like the impression that I get. Who is that? It's not me, is it? Somebody's car is going off. I will occasionally set mine off by accident. It's my pockets get very full. You can draw your own conclusion there. But
Okay.
I digress. But I don't like what happens in a lot of these commercials where they think the voting public is stupid.
Right.
Or they position you as stupid. One of my favorites is to think that anybody will vote for somebody on the basis of the fact that they're independently wealthy and would donate their salary. I find that insulting.
And that actually brings up a very good point, Bill, where I think a very major mistake was made by that campaign. I personally think it was an unfair attack ad, and that I think even though it's very tough to explain to most people, I think that there is a legitimate defense that once Congressman Abraham realized that there were limits on the outside income he could make as a physician, and he quickly discovered he couldn't make money, all of a sudden he needed that congressional salary. But if he's still giving money to St. Jude, what's the big deal? In other words, I don't think it was an entirely truthful attack.
It was not truthful.
It was not.
But it's also, I don't like putting that in your campaign ad.
Right, because
that tells me you think I'm really stupid.
Right, and actually that brings up another good point. This to me is the quicksand that the Abraham people got themselves into, in my opinion. If you're going to do virtue signaling like that, you're setting yourself up for a fall. Because you got to remember, what I think hurt Abraham more than anything else with that attack ad is not so much the fact that he went ahead and took a salary anyway, but the fact that the impression is created that, it's just another politician not keeping his promises. That's the worst sin you can create in politics.
Well, and then there's a couple more. You voted with Pelosi over 3,000 times.
Exaggeration.
Now maybe the public is stupid, but I find that insulting because we all know that on the floor of Congress, you have votes to open a discussion.
Yes.
You have votes to adjourn and name post offices.
Procedurals.
Procedurals.
Right.
And it probably all 455 voted with the speaker.
Right.
Or with the minority leader. And I just think
That's a gotcha.
I don't like when somebody is running for high political office and they throw that crap out there, assuming that most of us are stupid.
Right, and in my opinion, if you were to subdivide the three components of that attack that Risponi did on Abraham, only one of those three, in my opinion, is a legitimate attack, and that is the 44% absenteeism record.
Yeah.
That's highly legitimate, especially when the Abraham campaign is doing everything they can to downplay or kind of be snarky about it. So that's a legitimate line of attack. But the bit about voting with Pelosi and not supporting Donald Trump and all, that to me was stretching the limits of the truth. I would also say, however, that it's kind of a case of shame on the Abraham campaign for not effectively defending their candidate on that line of attack, because all Ralph Abraham had to do was the very next day after that text say, here's the truth. I'm with President Trump. I don't vote with Pelosi. I want to make Louisiana great again. My opponent's resorting to desperate attacks, period, end of sentence. And you still have more time to spare in a 30-second ad. That, to me, is the biggest case of neglect, is that the Abraham campaign did not adequately defend its candidate.
Let's talk about down ballot races a little bit. Hotly contested insurance commissioner's race. In fact, Commissioner Donelon will be with us in just a few moments.
Yes.
Has any of your polling gotten in there at all?
It's a fascinating race. The thing that I find interesting is it has consistently been, give or take a few points, a 25-25 race, which to me is a danger sign, because the thing is, it's always tough as a down ballot incumbent to get appropriate press attention. And when you're polling in the 20s as an incumbent, that's something that you need to be, I guess, mindful of. You know, I think that what's interesting about that race is, given that you have, I guess, a high dollar campaign on both sides, it is the kind of marquee down ballot race, really more so than any other ones.
Now, the treasurer's race got interesting just a couple of days ago.
Okay.
Treasurer Schroeder's opponent has apparently hoarded his money and spent it on television, saying that Schroeder made a math error, and it's because he's not an accountant or an attorney, that he's got a degree in criminal justice, and so therefore you should hire me and I won't make these kind of errors. I don't know if it's impacted anything, but I find it very interesting because the treasurer is the banker.
Right.
The treasurer does not issue the checks. The refunds that were not correctly done were issued by Department of Revenue,
Right.
not the treasurer. So once again, we're stretching the truth in a great big
the
way.
accusation is scurrilous.
Yeah.
We are, and the treasurer's office is really a job that does not quite have the powers that is popularly thought to have. I think that John Kennedy kind of gave it a certain amount of publicity from basically the unclaimed property refunds.
Yeah.
But other than that, you're
Also
right.
being outspoken about the budget and things like that.
Sure.
right?
Yeah, and when people hear the word treasurer and criticize the budget, I think it does give you kind of some legitimacy in terms of, or excuse me, standing to attack the fiscal policies of whoever the governor is.
Let me ask you this though: is this challenger? And I apologize. I'm not being snarky here. I can't remember the guy's
Derek?
name. Thank you. Is he making a dent with this last-minute TV stuff?
Again, it goes back to what I said about the fact that, you know, within the last 7 days, people pretty much, number one, the airwaves are inundated with ads because all the consultants are being copycats by putting everything on the TV at the last minute at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Radio
basically-
this morning was, good God, every
Yes.
spot, at every set.
So to quote Tom Petty, you're basically a face in the crowd at that point, and people are not especially interested in hearing negative attack ads, especially in the last week. In my opinion, the window of attacking people is typically in that several weeks before early voting, where that's when people's minds are being formed, or opinions are being formed about who they support. You do a last-minute attack, people say, that's another one of those, and you change the channel.
Attorney General,
Yes.
anything there?
You know what's interesting about that is that Jeff Landry has done some really good, I would say, nonpartisan ads, and I think he'll be fine. And my polling shows that he and Billy are in very good shape. They're both ahead with absolute majorities of the vote, and with about 30% undecided, I figure they'll win in the 60s.
All right. What about Secretary of State?
That's an interesting one because I haven't really seen ads for anybody, but
Right, nobody.
the risk that Kyle has is that since he has not won a regular election, you'll recall, of course, that he won a special election last year, he does not yet have that kind of aura of incumbency that, you know, had he been running 4 years ago, he would have.
Well, and
But also
he's-
some of the, I'm sorry,
Oh,
Bill,
yeah,
some,
go ahead.
some of these down ballot races, if you have no particular complaint with the incumbent, people don't tend to vote to replace him.
Right.
Now, but in
Exactly.
Secretary of State, his opponent in the special, a very well-spoken lady, and she got a lot more vote with absolutely no money
Yes.
than anybody ever thought.
Yes.
And she has got huge grassroots support.
Yes.
Dr. Bo Clark is leaving the building.
Good seeing you, Bo.
Good to see you. Good luck.
Thanks.
And I mean, could there be a big vote percentage in this race?
Not a big vote percentage, but the fact that you have several people running, you do always have the risk of a runoff because I've pretty much seen no ads on that race.
Yeah.
And because you have a retread and then you have a couple of other candidates in the race, there's always that risk they could be pulling off 10 and 20% of the vote here and there.
Is there a danger of some of these candidates, especially incumbents, who feel like they don't have a threatening challenger, so they're not going to spend?
Very much. And one of the dirty little secrets about where voters' attention is if you are the governor and or U.S. senator, that to me gives you the best name recognition. If you are down ballot and or in the legislature, your name recognition is not quite as good. I've actually been polling races even up to this point where I'm seeing 40 and 50% undecided this late. Quite honestly, when the undecideds are that high this late, there is a huge risk of there being flip the coin kind of behavior when people get to the voting booth. The other thing too which happens, and again this is one of those little dirty secrets, I once did a calculation where depending on how many offices you have to vote for, I've typically seen a 3 to 5% drop off with each hop down the ballot. In other words, as you go from governor to lieutenant governor to secretary of state, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time you get down to the constitutional amendments, you're typically talking 80 to 90% of the number of people who actually voted for governor. Again, that's a big risk when you're talking about voters who are vanishing before they get to your race.
They don't finish the ballot.
Exactly, because there's no crime in having an incomplete ballot.
Now, Mike Strain, Agriculture Commissioner, there's 5 people in that race.
Yes.
And a couple of them appear to have what I consider to be rather odd qualifications that they put forth for that race. Is any of that moving the needle at all?
Not really, but you know what's kind of interesting in that race, and I had polled that one as well a couple weeks ago. You have alphabetically the first 2 candidates in the race are Green and Greer. Both of them are Democrats. I quite literally can see some confusion if you are a Democratic primary voter, because one of the things, again, one of those dirty little secrets about voting is if you have that favorable ballot placement as in alphabetically you're the first name, just ask Charles Bustani and Gwen Collins Greenup, it does matter in terms of getting a few percent of the vote if you have a confused electorate. So you're a Democrat, you've done your bit for governor, lieutenant governor, and so forth. You go down to agriculture commissioner, you're wondering if there's a typo between Green and Greer. I could see, one taking votes from the other and vice versa.
All right, now Peanut, Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser's beautiful elephant prop is not the only elephant in the room.
Correct.
The other elephant in the room is actually a dragon. It is St. George.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
So what's interesting about St. George, you have a couple things going on. The first is when I analyzed the early voting numbers for St. George, which, by the way, probably earned me a few gray hairs because you basically have to go down to the street and the street address level to see who's in St. George and who's not.
You don't have all your operatives, your shady people in the shadows that can do that for you?
I'm a self-service kind of guy. But
You
anyway,
notice he didn't deny it.
no, just
Rudy
myself, and I.
Giuliani is coming to see you.
I think I know where he's going with this.
Yeah, but anyway, point being is the boundary lines are very convoluted, which in my opinion was a very major tactical mistake the St. George people did. All they had to do, in my opinion, I get the cute talking point about we wanted to, honor the request of those who indicated they didn't want to sign the petition, blah, blah, blah. All you had to do was cut off the line at I-10. In other words, once you get down to, say, Gardere, Oak Hills, the subdivisions down Highland Road and so forth, support for St. George is noticeably less than it is in places like, say, Hickory Ridge, Shenandoah, Azalea Lakes, Hoosiatu Road, and so forth. So all you had to do to honor the wishes of the petition, in other words, never try to make things confusing for the voters.
Now,
because you're going to have people who are going to go vote tomorrow, and they're going to think they're in St. George when they're not. And I could see
I've already heard people talking of this.
there's going to be some upset people who are probably going to have a scene with the commissioners, which to me is not democracy.
Well, and again, in fairness, in analyzing this, I do remember after the last go-round, the council member and other council members who did not represent particularly the Gardere district made a big stink about tell these people that you don't want to be part of their incorporation, that you want to be part of the city of Baton Rouge.
Right.
If you remember, and in that type of neighborhood, their politicians and their preachers pretty much dictate where they're going to go.
Right. Yeah, and my attitude is, like I said, a lot of that could have been solved by putting the line at I-10. Instead, what they did was they got too cute. If you follow the lines along, say, Bluebonnet and Jefferson, and I think Stumberg as well, you'll see these little weird notches in there. Those notches are apartment complexes. In my opinion, it would not have been that big of a deal just to have kept the lines simple to eliminate confusion with the voters. But anyway, getting to the main point of St. George.
I'd just like to offer this up for conversation,
You may.
though. The city's lines are pretty convoluted in places.
Nowadays they are, yes.
Especially since they started, bringing people
Adding
in.
them all and,
adding them all, et cetera.
Yeah.
You look over there at the city lines, and it's pretty freaky.
Well, when we lived in River Bend, and we had a fire station, a brand new fire station.
Oh, yeah, the polling place wasn't there.
Directly across the street. Well, not only that, they would not throw water on my house if it caught fire. I had to wait for St. George to come, which, of course, they have a proper and fast response. But because Brightside Lane, the city limit, was on the right-hand or westbound lane, and the eastbound lane was the parish. So we have we've always had some strange lines.
But one thing I do want to say about St. George, again, kind of getting off the soapbox about what I think were not properly drawn lines, but getting into the hard data, I did see when I analyzed early voting turnout for quote-unquote St. George, early voting was through the roof, and it was more heavily Republican.
Yep.
As in, we're talking about early voting that was 3 times what it was in the 2015 primary. So in other words, being that plus the fact that it's a Republican early vote, I do think that those supporting St. George are much more fired up than those against, and I found it telling that Mayor Brune felt it necessary to go canvassing door to door against it. In other words, those against St. George are pulling out all the stops to try to stop it, but I don't think I think it'll pass about 60%.
I will say this. I admire the mayor for putting her money where her mouth is.
Well, sure.
She got out there and she walked an area that could go either way and said, "May
She
I talk
waited
to you?"
pretty late to do it, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She waited pretty late to do it. And, some of these St. George people, it's not so much some kind of a civic pride thing as much as they have an adversarial attitude towards City Hall.
Oh, absolutely. And let's be honest, this is going all the way back to the busing order in 1981. It is something that has never been formally solved. And that part, you have to remember, back in 1977, which for years and years you did not have schools being built in the new part of East Baton Rouge Parish. Back when the busing order was issued, a lot of that area that now is quote-unquote St. George was pretty much unpopulated, so you had no school construction going on, yet that part of the parish has seen a disproportionate amount of the growth. So there is some legitimacy to their complaints. I just think, though, that the reality is when you had new school systems open up elsewhere in the parishes, they had to raise taxes, and I believe that they would have to do something similar to St. George. My attitude is be transparent with the voters about, hey, you want a new school system? I agree with you, but it's going to cost you. But would you rather that or send your kids to private school? I mean, be truthful to the voters is my attitude.
John, we got about 2 minutes.
I was going to ask gut check. Will you St. George pass?
60%.
Yeah. Real quickly, do you poll any of the smaller state representative and Senate
Absolutely.
races? All right, let's talk about a couple of Senate seats. The one that's being vacated by Dan Claytor. Who's likely to make the runoff there?
So I'll say, what I'll say in general, I predict there'll be runoffs in Senate District 16, which is Dan Claytor's district. There'll be a runoff in Senate, House District 68, which is Steve Carter's district. House District 70, which is in Franklin Foyle's district. In each of the 3 cases, I believe a Democrat will make the runoff because Democratic strength in East Baton Rouge Parish has been steadily increasing due to demographic changes and to a more liberal, I guess, vote here in Baton Rouge. So I believe there'll be Democrats in the runoffs, and even though they'll lose, I do think that this is kind of the test case for those in the Emerge Louisiana group. As to which Republican makes the runoff in each of those races, well, I think Representatives Carter and Foyle are battling it out in that district. In the House district, Steve Carter's district, that honestly is a free-for-all because you have multiple candidates running. The Franklin Foyle seat, I see that as a case of whether Mike DiResto or Barbara Freiberg makes the runoff against Belinda Davis.
Really? Scott McKnight is not going to get in that?
He can, but you also have other Republicans running as well. And because you have a fragmented vote on the Democratic and Republican side, I see this similar as what happened in 1995 when Bill Daniel and Samuel Bologna Rivas made the runoff. They all made about 20% of the vote, where literally 1 or 2% separated the winners from the losers.
Now, before we go, we've been saving this. Are you going to join John Delgado and Chandler Loop in endorsing Gary Chambers for the Senate?
Wow. Oh, I'll just say that I vote in Senate District 16.
I let Bo Clark leave without trying to get the commitment papers started for those two. John
The
Couvillon.
response to that post on Facebook was amazing. People were going,
Like I
really?
said, if
Really?
Bo was conducting business, but I was going to start the commitment papers for both of those guys. Good God Almighty, John Couvillon. People can watch you tomorrow night on WVLA and WGMB, right?
Correct. I'll be providing election analysis and/or calling races on the governor's race and St. George, and so I have all my precinct data ready to go, and I'm looking forward to doing it. I should be on the evening news tomorrow night and/or the election coverage starting with the polls close at 8 o'clock.
And you've got a brief visit with Rocket Right Radio tomorrow afternoon.
I do, correct.
And then
That's 3 o'clock tomorrow.
we're going to give you a little breathing room and come back for all the runoffs.
I'd be more than happy to.
Thank
John,
you.
Always good to see you. my
Always
friend.
good to have you. John Couvillon, his company is JMC Analytics. He is an expert demographer and pollster, and John, as always, we thank you. Coming up, Commissioner of Insurance Jim Donelon, locked in a race for re-election. And Commissioner, why don't you come on over this way? You want to talk about an advertising campaign that turned real nasty real quickly. In the Commissioner of Insurance race, it got kind of nasty. And I don't think that it was the incumbent who fired the first shot on that one, but he's given back as good as he gave. He joins us now. Commissioner Donelon, good morning to you.
Good morning. Glad to be with you.
We were talking earlier, before you got here, about some of the political commercials in the governor's race, and some of the accusations kind of specious, and we knew you were going to come on with us, so we wanted to give you a chance to talk about, over the last 3 weeks, things have gotten a little nasty in your race.
No question about that. It all started with a disgruntled policyholder with deep pockets out of Iowa, Louisiana, named Lee Mallett. Put up billboards all over Baton Rouge and all over his home area of Lake Charles with untruths, half-truths, and just out-and-out lies. I ignored it for a month or two. I thought, actually, driving in this morning, I saw the billboard one last time. I thought I had seen it for the last time at the end of September, but I was just missing it. For example, he says that I refused to return $20,000 worth of campaign contributions I received from a billionaire in North Carolina who has been indicted for attempting to bribe the North Carolina commissioner. Well, that's a half-truth. I didn't return his money to him because under the rules that I go by, you don't give the money back to the bad guy. I gave the money back to, it was 15, not 20. I've never met the man. No one's ever told me anything about him other than he's a mega donor to Republican causes in North Carolina and Florida and some in Louisiana, apparently.
Well, I wanted to give
But
him-
if I could finish,
Oh, no,
what I
please.
did with the money when it was asked if I was going to return it was instead donate it to cystic fibrosis, $5,000, St. Michael's Special School, $5,000, and Tulane Cancer Research Center, which, by coincidence maybe, was my second opinion source when I was battling cancer twice a couple of years back, and was impressed with the operation there.
Well, I have always liked the regulations from Federal Election Commission, FCC, and I really almost made a phone call on that ad simply because they said this guy was indicted by the FBI so that they could work FBI in. FBI can't indict a ham sandwich.
Not yet.
No. The Justice Department can indict somebody.
Yes, indeed.
The federal court, the federal prosecutor can. But I mean, you can see the lengths to which it went to try to make sure that they worked. They even had an FBI raid jacket in the picture.
No doubt about it. The ads have gotten really out of control. The lies and half-truths and innuendos and tricks with language that make it seem like somebody's being endorsed by some other entity when in truth and in fact, they're not.
Jim, there's also something that people are not well aware of, because I've heard a lot of discussion about it. And can the insurance commissioner set the rates?
Of course not.
But you do have some control over whether the rates are increased or not, right?
Absolutely. In 15 states, ours included, by law, not by my choice, there's prior approval required for any rate increases and, for that matter, any rate decreases, because some companies, Champion Insurance Company comes to mind, will lower their rates to get more volume in as the ship is going down.
Boy, I remember that.
Cost the state $150 million, 1990s dollars. $300 million adjusted for inflation to today?
Yeah.
So-
It could be, what's happening in the advertising, because as I said, in fairness, you've given back as good as you got.
Yes, sir.
You talk about your opponents serving on a commission that a lot of people feel didn't do their job properly. But
BP claims. Yes, sir.
Let's talk a little bit about where you are today, as we are simply now about, I guess, we're about 19 hours away from when the polls open.
Absolutely. But in truth, Bill, the polls opened about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, all the early voting. Yeah.
And my parish, get this, my parish of Jefferson had an 88% increase in early voting over 4 years ago. And parish next door, it went from 14,000 votes cast to 24,000 votes cast in early voting. Next door in Orleans, it went from 23 4 years ago to 24, which is pretty similar to the statewide average. Now, I don't pretend that they were flocking to the polls to vote for their native son, Jim Donelon, to re-elect him insurance commissioner. There's a lot of hot local races going on in my home parish, similar to what's happening here in East Baton Rouge with the St. George issue, driving folks to the polls. So it's interesting. The polls have opened, and we are on the eve of the election, and we're excited and optimistic about what will happen tomorrow. Although the polls are tight, no question.
We've talked with Mr. Temple, and he's done some other media, and he's basically run on, I'm going to get your car insurance rates down.
Yeah.
Is it that easy? I mean, how would you go about doing it if that were the mission?
Well, it is the mission.
It is the
It is the mission, and I will continue to do just what I did. And I will tell you, we're going to do it next year. And the reason we're going to be successful next year, unlike what happened this year with tort reform, is because there's such a focus, such a spotlight on insurance costs in this state. The governor's race has been in large part about it. The legislative races, ad after ad after ad, candidates are running on, I'm going to lower your insurance costs. We've never had that before. We had a similar experience in the aftermath of Katrina and Rita in the property insurance market, when everybody going door to door, knocking doors for campaigns in the legislative races, got asked about, what are you going to do about the homeowners crisis we have in our state? And we did. We did a building code. We got rid of the old Insurance Rating Commission. We did an incentive program. Governor Blanco, bless her heart, stood tall, didn't resort to demagoguery and promising to do unrealistic things. She joined with me, went out and attracted companies to our market more than ever before, even as the big national carriers were bailing out of not just our coastal exposure, but all coastal exposure. Back to auto rates and my authority to regulate them. There's only 15 states out of 50 that have prior approval of rates for auto, homeowners, workers' comp, like we have here for all P&C products. And it is a good thing in many cases. There are two words that I won't go into with your listeners because it's much too technical, but price optimization in the auto insurance, in the property insurance area, and EquiCat, a catastrophe modeler used by many of the major national carriers, that in both cases demonstrated the need for oversight. And we rejected filings that would have implemented price optimization and implemented rates based upon EquiCat. And that proved the need for regulation and oversight of those rates. But to say I should put my foot on the brakes and not let prices go up when companies are losing money is really just demagoguery, because we can't control that. California can't control putting their brakes on auto insurers and making them sell for less than the cost of their product. They left California after Proposition 101 a couple of years ago. Florida, similar, after Charlie Crist got elected and put the state in the insurance business competing with the private sector. It just doesn't work that way.
There are, I saw something. It might have been an ad. I think it was an ad talking about loggers insurance and things like this. And I don't think people realize how many different insurance products come under the purview of the Department of Insurance.
All of them. Anything that is an insurance product is under our regulation by the rules and laws and limits and powers vested with us under what's called Title 22, the Insurance Code. That's where all of our mandates, that's where all of our solvency requirements, that's where all of my authority, receivership, conservatory authority, et cetera, is spelled out. I can't do what they don't authorize me to do, and I must do what they mandate me to do. And insurers must do what they mandate people to do. For example, our 3-year rule in the homeowners arena. Homeowners insurance, we have the only such law in America, in Louisiana. Oh my goodness, it was so helpful to us after Katrina and Rita. When companies were bailing out, I had a huge fight, if you recall, with Allstate, trying to get off of 30,000 policies in 19 coastal parishes. They tried 3 different ways, but they couldn't do it because in our law is a provision that says if you and your homeowner's insurer have been together for 3 or more years, they cannot non-renew you, they can't change your premium, they can't change your deductible on an individual basis unless they do it to their whole statewide book of business. Unless you don't pay your premium, you set fire to the property, you have 2 or more non-act of God claims, broken pipes, dog bite type claims, but not act of God claims, hailstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes. You and they are married for as long as they do business in the state of Louisiana. It kept tens of thousands of policies in place after those events. Not as important today because we have 31 new small regional companies competing with the exiting big national carriers for business. And that has caused rates in the homeowners arena to go up only 1% per year, 5 years running now. That's competition working as it always does to protect policyholders.
I had someone leave me with a question to ask you, and they really want an answer because they don't know, and quite frankly, I don't either. Do the insurance companies, insurance annuities that they sell as financial products now, that many brokerages now have an insurance license, many insurance licensed agents simply sell this, and basically they're selling an insurance product as an investment. Does that come under your purview as well?
Some of it does, and some of it does not. The solvency of those companies putting those annuity products out comes under every state's jurisdiction on a home state basis primarily. But we enforce that solvency regulation on a national basis by doing what's called an accreditation program through the NAIC. So that if I don't meet the solvency requirements in law and in practice of the national model laws that the NAIC has adopted, then we can lose our accreditation. If that happens, our national companies like Pan American Life, like the Gray Insurance Company that sell in all 50 states, won't be allowed to sell in any other state because their home state regulator is not meeting the standards required by the accreditation program of the NAIC.
Jim, many years ago, the state was forced to create its own insurance company, its own property insurance company, Louisiana Citizens.
Actually, before that, they had what's called the Fair and Coastal Plans
Fair and Coastal
under the
Plans.
PIAL, right.
But it's been your mission to reduce the number of people in that book of business because that's really expensive property insurance. Give us a progress report.
Sure, absolutely. And it's even more than the fact that it's expensive for those who have to get their insurance through Citizens, the market of last resort, priced every year above the private sector,
Is it 10%?
plus 10%. Plus 10%. The most expensive in each parish, plus 10%. And certainly that's a burden for those who have to get their coverage there. But it's also a burden for all the rest of us because when the next Katrina hits, and one day it will, an assessment had to be put, a bond issue had to be issued for $1 billion to finish paying off the claims that Katrina caused to citizens in 2005. We're still paying an assessment each year with 6 more years left to run on it, 14 years after that event. So everybody is impacted if the Citizens Book of Business, A, is too large, and when I took office, it was number 3 property insurer in the state, behind only State Farm and Allstate. At 9.8% of our property insurance market share, 173,000 policies. Today, it's got 39,000 policies, 0.5% of our market share, and is about the 45th largest writer of property insurance in our state. And frankly, we had to slow down the takeout that those private companies that have come to our state since Katrina, we're taking those policies out. We had to slow it down by changing the law that said we had to offer them to we can offer them takeout on an annual basis. We had to slow it down because we have to maintain a minimum structure in place to service the policies and to be available for the next Katrina when another $1 billion worth hit comes that way.
We've had some fights that have happened largely at the congressional level since Katrina and Rita and Gustav, and then, of course, the big flood here in 2016.
Yes, sir.
And I've wondered, when we talk about the nationally insured, the National Federal Flood Insurance Program, when they come in and decide that they are going to revise premiums, do they ever come to your door and say, help us do this in a fair and circumspect way, or do they just do what they want because they are a federal program?
They do what they want because they're a federal program. But having said that, David Marstead used to be the deputy director of the National Flood Insurance Program. Under the new administration, he's been elevated. He is the director now. And he's on my speed dial. I have his cell phone number. He has mine. We communicate often and closely. And in fact, there's a big move afoot at Treasury to come out with Flood Insurance 101 or version 2 or whatever they're calling it these days. And it is still not unveiled, and we are apprehensive about the implications for us, the most dependent state in America, on that national flood insurance program. And when I say we're dependent, what happened when they reauthorized it 6 years ago under Biggert Waters, the glide path to actuarial rates for all policies in the program would have rendered tens of thousands of Louisiana properties worthless overnight because the rate of increases was so prohibitive, no one could have afforded them. They couldn't have sold their property because they couldn't get a flood insurance policy because the cost of the flood insurance would have been so prohibitive. So they rolled that back. I did carry to the White House, to a meeting with the president, a letter from GNO Inc. with signatures from up and down the Atlantic coast and all around the Gulf Coast urging that rollback, and it happened. Today, the same fight is playing out in the reauthorization. We're now reauthorization number 14 or whatever. It's been reauthorized till the end of next month in the continuing resolution, and the negotiations continue. There's a big fight between the fiscal hawks who want the program to be put on its own feet and pay for itself, or privatize the business and let the private sector take it over. And those of us dependent on the program, Louisiana more than any other state, who need a federal backstop or market of last resort at an affordable price because our economy is dependent on it. We're not just a pristine white sandy beach retirement coast. We're a working coast. We have ports, we have oil and gas, we have chemical plants, fisheries, all of the above, who require school teachers and police and the rest in order to stay residing in those areas that are very flood prone.
I think the big discussion, and I think a lot of people discuss it, I think a lot of people don't understand the nuances of it, is in fact tort reform in the state of Louisiana.
No question.
And everybody talks about how much more we pay in insurance because of our court climate when it comes to injury, personal injury, torts, things like that. What are the real steps that we can get going to do something here about tort reform and maybe have an impact down at the average citizen level?
No question about it. It is number one. Every time we've had a crisis in insurance, it took the legislature to fix a broken part of our system. Med malpractice back in the 80s, workers' comp back in the 90s. In the aftermath of Katrina and Rita, our property insurance market was skewed. We needed a statewide building code. We needed to get rid of the rating commission. And the legislature, in the crisis environment, does do ultimately what the public demands of them to do. And that's going to happen, I am convinced, next year in the legislature when tort reform that we were unsuccessful with this past session, although we got 69 votes in the House out of 105, bipartisan, across party lines support, it got killed, bottled up, and killed in what I refer to as the lawyer committee on the Senate side. And it's the Judiciary A committee, committee.
We've mentioned this before.
Oh, yes.
Where good bills go to
We've
die.
called their
That's
name.
exactly right. And to tell you how bad it is, Blaine Briggs here in Baton Rouge is the CEO of Louisiana Farm Bureau Insurance Company. They're part of a 6-state holding company headquartered in Jackson, Mississippi, Southern Farm Bureau Property and Casualty. Southern Farm Bureau's umbrella has 6 state farm bureaus in its book of business: Colorado, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Florida. In those 6 states, every year I go to their annual meeting at the Marriott with Commissioner of Agriculture, Mike Strain. We get to address their 400 or 500 attendees, and I check with Blaine before I take the podium, and he says, I ask, are the numbers the same? Numbers are the same. He actually told me this year they tweaked a little worse, but not enough to bother. Those numbers are, in those 6 states, we are 17% of the auto policies in force in Southern Farm Bureau. In those 6 states, year in and year out, we are 51% of the pending lawsuits, over 17% of the policies.
Wow.
3 times our proportionate share. That's a great example of just how out of whack our judicial system is. But you really don't need that. You drive down the interstate, look at the billboards. You turn on the TV, look at the Oprah show or the Hallmark Channel or
Pretty much
whatever.
anything.
Every ad, every other ad is promoting litigation. And we've been described as a judicial hellhole by chamber groups nationally. So I think we need to lower our jury threshold from the $50,000 highest in America right to a jury trial down to $5,000, which there's only 15 states that have any at all. We're the highest at 50. Maryland is second at 15. The other 13 have 5,000. Get rid of the backyard fence cases. You don't need a jury trial for that. I agree. But anything significant, it's with this jury threshold we have now, insurance companies don't even try to defend themselves with the minimum limits policies, which we are 45% minimum limits policies. They just give out the $15,000 check like cotton candy.
It's cheaper for us to settle it.
Exactly. Number 2, it's called direct action. We're one of 4 states that has a direct action statute. What that says is if you're suing someone over an injury in an automobile accident or what have you, you can not only name the person you're suing, but you can also put in the caption the name of their insurance company. The deep pocket that is easy to reach into, out-of-state, big, profitable insurance company. What they don't know or say in doing that is we in Louisiana pay on a state-by-state basis. Every other state is treats it the same way. Our losses are limited and paid for by our policyholders. California doesn't subsidize Louisiana, and we don't subsidize Iowa. It's state by state. So when they give out those $15,000 checks, they're really giving out our money because they get it back in rate increases that they show their losses in our state alone.
Last year, there were legislative attempts. None of them passed, but to curtail the amount of advertising lawyers could do, particularly outdoor. I'm just curious, how do you feel about curtailing? I mean, they're advertising for something people obviously want.
No doubt. I think it's impossible. When I came out of law school, it wasn't allowed. The big advertising trick back then was if you merged or you hired new partners, you could send an announcement out to all the other lawyers and to your clients. Now, the Supreme Court has said freedom of speech guarantees the right to lawyers to advertise as they deem appropriate. There are limitations on some of the advertising that the Bar Association allows with regard to, I got $300,000 or hiring Irma Thomas to sing on your ad. There are limitations, but not anything that will rein in the billboards and television ads that are so prolific.
Well, love them or hate them, they're an economic engine, too.
Oh, no question.
I mean,
no
it's
question.
money injected into the economy.
And I will also add, the ones you see that got 400,000 or 300, those folks were really injured. You have a jury that tries those cases.
Yeah.
You have the right to it, and you don't collect that amount of money from a jury without having the ability to demonstrate serious injury.
And those claims and those ads have to be absolutely verifiable.
They do.
That Morris
They do.
Bart got me $250,000.
That's correct. That has to be truthful, or you're subject to sanction by the Bar Association. And that's not where the abuse is. The abuse, as I mentioned earlier, is in those $15,000 checks that are handed out like cotton candy.
Well, and again, we all pay for that in our premiums. Commissioner, we are coming down to the last 2 minutes here, and Election Day is tomorrow. If there's anything you'd like to add, now would be the time.
Well, I truly appreciate it, Bill, and I've enjoyed greatly the opportunity to interact with you guys over the years. Look forward to doing it for 4 more years. I do believe we'll get tort reform next year, and that will rein in our out-of-whack auto insurance rates, but competition is the ultimate best protection for consumers. We have more insurers doing business in our state now than ever before. I came in after Katrina, Rita, and 3 straight insurance commissioners went off to jail. The market was devastated. Companies were fleeing in droves out of Louisiana. Today we are respected, and we are transparent and non-political in our environment, our regulatory environment, and that has served us well in attracting competition to our market, lowering homeowners, workers' comp, and even this year, auto insurance for 1/2 of the drivers in our state.
Commissioner Jim Donelon, up for re-election. Tomorrow is Election Day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
Appreciate your joining us.
Good to see you again.
A little housekeeping business. Kevin and I do want to remind everybody that the polls open tomorrow morning early. You can go before you go to tailgate for either Southern or LSU, or you can go before you go to the hunting camp. It's also the first day for a couple of hunting seasons tomorrow.
It is.
But it's always important that you go and vote. Now, many of us, and I'm one of them, I don't know if it's happened to you, Kevin, have had our polling place change.
My polling place has not changed. My early voting place did change the last 2 election cycles. It's moved down the street.
Well, that was just for you.
But the regular polls for me have always been at pretty much the same place.
Well, if your polling place has changed, you can. You should have gotten a card, by the way, from the Registrar of Voters about 5 weeks ago. You can also look at either the Clerk of Court's website, I believe, the Registrar of Voters website, or Go Vote, the Secretary of State's website, and you put in your address and zip code, and it tells you where your polling place is. You can also look at your sample ballot. For those of you who don't know whether you're in the proposed St. George or outside of the proposed St. George,
the ballot will tell you.
Yeah.
Somebody the other day on Facebook was going, I couldn't find St. George on my ballot. Well, obviously, if it wasn't on your ballot for early voting,
you're not
in St. George.
Yeah, you're not in the area. But go ahead and look now. And there are people that will take your questions today at the Registrar of Voters office and at the Secretary of State's office. So, don't be afraid to ask a question. You still got plenty of time.
Never be afraid to ask a question. Never be afraid. If you're in that polling booth behind the curtain and you have a question, ask.
Yeah, the polls close by statute at 8 p.m. However, anybody who is at a polling place and standing in line ready to vote at 8 p.m. will still be allowed to vote, even if it takes till 8:30 or 9 or 10 or however long it takes. So you will not be locked out. And it is one of the most important trusts that are given the populace in a democracy, and that is your vote.
Well, I get on this every time at voting. The fact that so many of us do let elections come and go and we don't cast our vote. You do realize there are countries not far from America, South America, Central America. Look at Venezuela. Mm-hmm. I mean, and other parts of the world where people sometimes will get the living crap beat out of them for daring to show up at the polls to cast their legal vote. And, we've got the ability to go to the polls, cast our vote, and make our voice heard, and not have to worry about life and limb or bullies beating on us or anything like that. Don't waste that. Don't waste that.
Again, thank you all so much for joining us on these podcasts. We are looking to do some different things in the future that will include you. We'll let you know. Come back on Tuesday. We will be talking about the runoffs, I'm sure, as well as some generalized news for our area. And we might even have a wow, I didn't see that one coming for you on Tuesday. And also later next week, the brand new Our Lady of the Lake Children's Hospital. You know, Kevin and I have supported this for years and years and years. We're going to get their Director of Patient Care Services to give us some of the gee whiz, and there's plenty of it, in this new children's hospital.
Oh, the place is amazing. It's just
and
amazing.
They will be treating kids from every state in the union and also from a couple of foreign countries, as they always have been. Now, they got their own new place to do it in, which is really, really terrific. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the games.
I'm going to throw one more quick thing in.
All right.
If by any chance you want to email, you can reach out to us on the Morning Exiles Facebook page. You just send us a message there. Or you can send an email to me. The email address is kevin@kgallaghervoice.com.
I need to throw one more thing in, too. You ready?
Yeah.
Boom!
Until Tuesday, take care. Have a great weekend. And go Tigers!
Bye.